Welcome, everybody, to this episode of SteeleWatching. We are talking about episode 8 of season 1, You're Steele the One for Me. I am Eric.
And I'm Sara.
This episode first aired on November 26, 1982. It was written by Lee Zlotoff and directed by Thomas Carter. And I got to say, this, Remington Steele has this thing where all the episode titles have Steele in it.
Yeah.
And very often, Steele is a replacement for the word still.
Yep.
This one is unique because it's really not.
It's kind of the other way around.
Yeah, because you think it's supposed to be a replacement for still. You're still the one for me. But in fact, it's actually you're Steele, the one for me, with a comma in there.
Commas, they are important, people, says the English teacher. They can totally change a sentence. Here's your lesson for the day. It's the difference between let's eat grandma and let's eat grandma.
I've heard that one before and it's good. Yes.
Commas save lives.
At least grandma's life.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, episode synopsis. I went to Judith Moose's book. Another plug for Judith Moose's book, Steele Loved After All These Years. If you haven't got it, go find a copy or get a hold of Judith and get the Adobe Acrobat version of it. It's worth it.
Yep.
Anyway, I didn't like the TV guide synopsis, so I went with the original production synopsis, which goes as follows. When Laura tells Remington to stop intruding on her detective work, he asks her to teach him the ropes. She agrees to let him observe her investigate a routine, in quotes, auto accident, which begins to look more and more like an oriental underworld murder. Steele says it's murder.
Yeah, he's right.
Yes.
He's right.
Not the first time.
No.
Probably won't be the last. So, the funeral and Steele bailing on the Chamber of Commerce luncheon. That's what he's paid to do.
Yep.
Paid. That's what he's supposed to be doing. We've talked about it before where he's really probably not getting paid cash money too much. I mean, he spends enough of the agency's money anyway, so he doesn't need to get paid. But he bails on the luncheon and he shows up at the funeral and tells Mike Ito that he will personally look into the case of his brother's death, who Mike says was murdered. What do you think? Steele again going off the rails.
So I have a couple of thoughts on this because he shows up theoretically when he's supposed to be at this luncheon. The first thing he does is he sits down and he's like, who was it? Your cousin, uncle, aunt, or whatever. He thinks it's somebody Laura knew. And
a relative?
My theory is one of two things. Either he knew that it was a client's family member or it was to do with a case, or he didn't know and he was somehow trying to get in, I don't want to say into her pants, but flirt with her over offering a shoulder to cry on. It's a very weird strategy. And I sort of hope it was the former, that he knew it was to do with a case and therefore he was, I don't know, just teasing her or whatever. But that part was weird. But the promising to handle the case when there isn't a case, I think he's trying to just talk Mike down. Because Mike Ito is probably the actor is, remember how we talked about how in Signed, Sealed, and Delivered, the actor that played Sheldon was so fantastic? The actor that plays Mike Ito is not. And
he's a little over the top at times.
He's so over the top. But then he I want to know what happened to my brother. And then he runs out of the building. Why? You're not going to get anyone to help you if you're running down the street. But they catch up to him and I think he's just doing it to talk him down. And to say, like, to validate his feelings. He says something like, you've just had a hell of a shock. You're hurt. You're desperate for answers. It sounds melodramatic, but it's also kind of him trying to get into Mike's shoes and to try to understand how Mike is feeling so that when he says, Laura, tell him who I am. And Laura's just like, oh, God, this is Remington Steele. And I guess the best part about this is that Mike doesn't care. His response is, so?
Yeah. I don't necessarily totally disagree, but I don't totally agree either. I don't think it's talking him down might be an element of it. I think it's just him overplaying the part of being Remington Steele. Oh, I am the boss. I am the great detective. And he's got this fantasy vision or false vision of what he, as the head of the agency, is supposed to do. And so he's doing what he envisions the head of the agency should be doing. But of course, he's wrong.
Yeah.
He's always wrong.
Well, a man can only doodle on his napkin for so long, right? He's got.
Oh, yes. But, you know, he overacts the part in this case. And so he takes on or agrees to take on a case that he has no business taking on simply because he's overacting, overplaying his part.
It's not the first time he's done it. I mean, he agreed to take on the Albie Furvitz case. Granted, he was kidnapped, but he could have, or his attempt to write a book, Remington Steele's 10 Most Famous Cases. So this is not out of character. So I do agree that in that sense, he is overacting. He is playing the part. He does expect Mike to be impressed when he says, Laura, tell him who I am.
Yes.
And Mike it's rather telling because Mike, as bad as the actor is, and he just lost his brother. He doesn't have the time or energy to be impressed.
Mm-hmm.
He's not interested in fawning over this detective who's standing there going, well, I'm Remington Steele. And I think Laura sort of knows that because she rolls her eyes before she says, Mike, this is Remington Steele. And it does placate him. It's interesting, too. If you watch that scene, Fred is standing there in the background just sort of watching. And he's kind of got a smirk on his face. And I don't know if it's just because the actor was told to just stand there and do something, and that was what he chose to do. But I wonder if Fred is even kind of laughing at him a little bit.
Well, you know, we've talked about Fred before and how he possibly does not know the gag, which I think we kind of concluded that he doesn't know that Remington Steele isn't Remington Steele. But at this point, he's got to be getting some sort of a clue that this guy is not what he's pretending to be or what he's being portrayed as being.
Yeah, that he's maybe not as qualified.
Yeah, I mean, he's got to be seeing his bumbling, his screw-ups, his lack of competence, and how Laura's constantly coming to the rescue. I mean, he's got to be seeing this. If he's observant at all.
The bit with Arnott and the Toodaloo. And they did have the limo before he showed up because you see it in that premiere episode. So whether you're right, he's probably not aware that Remington Steele doesn't exist, but he is aware that at one point he wasn't driving him around and now he is. And you're right, he's got to see that he's maybe not as competent. And maybe in the back of his mind, he's thinking, oh, I get why she's trying to hide him.
Yes. Maybe that's why he hasn't been around for so long. He's a, what's the term I'm thinking of?
He's a face.
He's a face. He fits the suit, but he's the titular head, but he's not the actual. He's the boss, but she's in charge.
Yeah,
I think is how they put it later in the episode or later in the series. So Mike wants to know what's happened to his brother. Oh, and I wanted to throw out one thing here. I found it, I was going to say curious, but this is Hollywood. This is California. This is American television. So I guess it's not really curious. Mike Ito is here in the United States. I say here because that's where I'm at.
There.
But he's in the United States. He's there. Yes. He's in California. So he has taken on the Americanization of things. So his name, Mike Ito, is Mike, his given name, Ito, the surname. His brother, Kenji, is from the Japanese culture. He's not been Americanized. So technically, his name should be Ito Kenji. So just a pointless, meaningless, trivial observation that has absolutely nothing to do with the episode, trivial in the context of the episode, but just I just thought that was something that should be mentioned.
I think that sort of leads into something else that should be mentioned, that this is a show from the 80s and that some of the stereotypes in this episode are maybe not accurate stereotypes. And, that's one of the criticisms I've seen in the Steele Watchers group is one of the reasons why this episode is maybe not a favorite, but it's 80s, right? They're going to have some parts that they maybe get wrong and some parts that they get right. And that kind of fits with that. Like they probably didn't do the research as to how the names would be shown. And therefore you're right. They're calling Kenji Ito instead of the other way around. When I was at university, I took a year of Japanese. Like I tried to learn it. I didn't do very well, but I will be the first to admit.
I tried to learn English, and I didn't.
That's true, yeah.
I
I got the first half credit, and then I dropped the second because I knew it was not going well. But I can catch some of the phrases, and I did notice that at some points they've got actors just saying the same words over and over again, and yeah, so there's that.
Yeah, might have been nice to have an actual Japanese-speaking person work on the script and work on the set to help get some authenticity and some accuracy in it. But like you said, this is the 1980s. This is Hollywood, California. We don't have to care about reality. We're actors.
Right. Exactly.
We make our own reality, and you should believe it.
It is what we say it is. So.
Yes, that's right. Okay, so at the office. Oh man, what a disagreement.
She's not happy.
No. You come barging in with no facts, no idea of what's going on, and then you have the nerve to just take over.
I mean, it's almost as if she's never met him.
Yeah. And I love her line when Steele says, Laura, the man was distraught. I know he was distraught. I can handle distraught. I once had to convince a drug-crazy killer that I was the Virgin of Guadalupe over the phone.
I wrote that quote down. I want to see that episode. That, or I want to know how that came to be. I'm very curious. They just throw that in there, and I spent the rest of the episode thinking about that, and I'm not happy.
Well, that's one of the things that makes so many TV shows kind of interesting is and of course gives so much fodder to fan fiction writers because they throw in these things and they don't have to explain them. They're just there to create the atmosphere. And this is great atmosphere.
100%. It does. Yeah.
Oh, and then his response of the story about the cat on the roof. He just can't get over that story about the cat on the roof.
I want the punchline for that too, because it runs throughout the episode. Every time there's a lull, he starts to tell this story about the cat on the roof, and we can't get him down. And I want to know what the metaphor. This is my English teacher brain, because he's clearly using this as a metaphor for what's going on. So, what's the metaphor? What is the story meant to convey? What's the symbolism here? Somebody help me out.
Well, I have heard that. And I'm trying to think of where I heard it. From what I remember, and I didn't look this up, I guess I probably should have. As I recall it, it starts with the cat's on the roof and we can't get him down. And then it gets more and more complicated until ultimately you get to the end where, well, the cat died.
He does mention the cat died at the end.
Yeah, so it's all a way of distracting from the fact that I don't want to tell you the cat died, but the cat died. And so you go through all this rigmarole and all this nonsense, and it gets more and more complicated until you get to the cat died, and then you've kind of lost the plot. And it's the fact that the cat died is kind of secondary at that point.
Is that an actual story then that he's telling? I thought it was just something that they made up for the purpose of the script, but is that a real story?
I've heard it before. It's something that has been around for a while. I want to say that it started as maybe part of a gag in an old comedy movie.
That sounds about right, considering the show.
Yeah, like maybe an Abbott Costello or something like that. But I don't know the origins of it.
This is the part where we tell our listeners to email us. or to, write in on the Steele Watchers group. If you know the answer to the cats on the roof and they can't get them down, please let us know.
Also in the office, they move into, I guess it's Laura's, and the fight continues. And this is where the whole notion of Remington Steele kind of changes in terms of the character, because his speech is, you might recall that I didn't invent Remington Steele as your superior. You did. And what makes you think that being the flashy front man is the cat's meow? Again, with the cat. So, bouncing around the rubber chicken circuit, glad handing old windbags in order to keep the agency's name in circulation, not to mention being shot at from time to time or bashed about by people because they think I know something that you have conveniently forgotten to tell me.
He's got a point there.
And it goes back and forth. You function in advisory capacity. It makes me sound like an invalid. You're not a detective. Then teach me. And there's where the whole thing pivots. Then teach me. Why not share your invaluable training? So we've talked about it in the past where he's kind of starting to get the idea that, well, at minimum, he should know a little bit about what's going on. And now he's progressed to the point where he's actually saying, teach me. Maybe he's not envisioning becoming a real live detective, but he's at least sensing that he has something to contribute given the opportunity and the training, which he's now recognizing he doesn't have.
I think part of it is that he wants to be taken seriously. She doesn't take him seriously. And he, up until this point, has not really given her much reason to. Given some of his actions and some of his behavior, he has almost created dug this hole for himself. And we can see it with the beginning. He did not know what she was at that funeral home for. He wasn't aware of Mike Ito. He wasn't aware of the case, or lack of case as she thought it was. He didn't know anything about that. He sailed in and, of course, made her very angry when he promised to look into it, but she hasn't been keeping him in on the loop. And he's got a point that he sometimes gets shot at. He got kidnapped once. He not only deserves to know, but if he's going to be put in danger, he deserves to have some kind of background to it. And I think you're right. I think he's just, this is the point. Part of it, I think he even admits later, is to win the argument.
Yes.
But he's also realizing that, as you said, he has something to contribute. He has some instincts and she's not noticing them. So he says, teach me. And I also like the comment of, does this look like the face of a whimsical man? That was a cute little.
Well, he's obviously getting frustrated at just being a clown, basically, or a poster boy, the guy that fits the suit. He knows that he's not a detective, and he's just kind of portraying this image, and he's getting tired of it. Yes, he did it just to kind of win the argument, but when people are arguing, when they're mad, when they're upset, or as we've talked before, when they're inebriated, things tend to come out that are really, I don't want to say symptomatic, but they are symptomatic in the sense that they reveal some of the inner feelings and the inner thoughts. And I think this, even though he said it in part to win the argument, I think there was some truth there that slipped out.
And I also wonder if there's a part of him that is somewhat jealous of Murphy, not as a romantic complication, but as her friend and confidant. Like, I think he knows that she's not attracted to Murphy, which is why he kind of tries to befriend him so often at the beginning. But he also knows that Laura trusts Murphy in a way that she doesn't trust him, and takes Murphy seriously in a way that she doesn't take him seriously. And maybe in his mind, the only real difference is that Murphy has the training and the history, and he doesn't have either one of those things. So he's maybe trying to put himself in that position, because you can see that when they're doing their little acronyms that they never use again any other time in the series. The C&D and Steele guesses complex and delicate. It's cut and dried. I actually kept a running tally of all the acronyms used here that are, again, dropped after this episode and never used again. But I think he might be a tiny bit jealous that Murphy has that friendship and that trust that he has yet to get from her. And he hasn't earned, frankly.
Yeah. And Murphy's busy. Murphy's doing stuff, whereas Steele really isn't doing anything. And not just from the standpoint of not contributing to the investigations, not contributing to the agency, other than just being a face. Being bored can be tough. That can be very hard work.
I wonder if it's also one of those things where, like, you think you want the job where you don't have to do anything and you just get money for. That sounds great on paper. But then when you're actually in that position where you're sitting through Chamber of Commerce luncheons and doodling on your napkin, that you're realizing, okay, no, I don't enjoy this. And I want to have more of a role and have more of, I want to be part of this, as opposed to standing on the sidelines, smiling and looking pretty, which is kind of amusing given that it's a bit of a gender flip. Usually that's something that, you get the female character doing, smiling and looking pretty and being the face. In this case, he's not enjoying it. He realizes that he wants a bit more. He wants to be a part of it a bit more.
So Laura says, okay, well, when the next case comes up, she calls his bluff, basically. She says, okay, fine, we'll do it. Next case that comes up. And he says, we've got one, remember? And he points out that it's a routine investigation done simply to ease the doubts of a grief-stricken man. What could possibly go wrong? That is the question you should know better than to ever ask in a TV show.
There is an episode of Buffy where Xander says, as long as nothing bad happens, and both Buffy and Willow freak out at him, and they said, why would you do that? Now something bad's going to happen. And he's like, well, you don't know. And she's like, yeah, well, I do know. Not until some idiot says, as long as nothing bad happens. Why would you do that? What were you thinking? Or were you even thinking at all? And that's kind of what I think of anytime I hear somebody say, well, what could go wrong? Oh, no.
So then they start investigating. And, I'm thinking back to in the Steele of the Night, I think it was the book with, or the episode with
Etched
Charlotte
in
Knight.
Steel.
Etched in Steel, thank you. Remington and Laura are arguing somewhat similar argument about, is there a case or isn't there a case? And Steele says to the effect that for there to be a case, there has to be unanswered questions, mysteries to be solved, and so on. And in this one, in the limousine, and Laura's positing all these questions, and it's like, okay, this fits the definition of a mystery.
Textbook definition.
Yes. If Mike is Kenji's only relative in town, and he didn't know about the accident, then who claimed Kenji's body from the authorities? Who arranged for the funeral? What were those, who were those people and what were they doing there? How did they know about it?
Yeah.
I mean, she starts listing off these questions, and it's like, what do you mean there's no mystery here?
I had that same comment in my notes. I said, him pulling out the notebook is funny. But then I've got, she asks some very good questions, which should have clued her into the fact that there was a case, as you said. And I wonder if she just hadn't even thought about those things until he pushed her. And then she starts to, oh, yeah, wait, we don't know this, this, and this.
But she still dismisses them as being indicators of anything untoward. It's just, okay, well, these are these questions, but they've all got simple answers. Okay, well, then what are the answers? Well, we don't know, but they've got simple answers. There's no mystery here.
Yeah, it is a bit of an odd one.
At the apartment building, looking for Mr. Hamada, Laura is lousy at charades.
She's terrible.
Car accident.
Yeah. And then it's great physical comedy, though, because you've got Steele poking at her, trying to alert her to the fact that the other neighbor is trying to tell her something. No, I really think I'm getting somewhere with this.
Totally oblivious. Yeah, this episode has a bunch of interesting, humorous, short little scenes that don't have a lot of detail in them, but they've got some interesting detail, and that's one of them. And then, of course, at the restaurant, I have to ask, I don't really remember sushi being that big of a deal back in the 1980s. Maybe in California, maybe in Los Angeles it was. I don't know. But in general, I don't remember it being that big of a deal.
This is another thing that many people in the Steele Watchers group take issue with, and I agree with them in the sense that it makes no sense, given his culinary background, that he would be so squeamish about sushi. I get maybe not liking it. He could have just said, it's not my thing. I don't enjoy it. But he doesn't even seem to know anything about it. She's the one kind of explaining it to him. And it seems a bit silly given that he's traveled the world, presumably, and knows we know he knows how to cook, or I guess we don't know that yet, but we know it later that he's a very good cook. So it just feels a bit odd that he's so freaked out by it. I agree.
Well, let's look at what we do know about him so far. I don't think we have any indication that he's ever worked in the Orient or the South Pacific areas. It's been either the United States, Europe, possibly Africa, because that's where the stones from the premiere episode, the Royal Labulite, came from. So I can see where he wouldn't have had an opportunity to really try sushi. He might have been aware of it. In fact, what he does say is that raw fish, isn't it? It all seems so desperate to me, rushing all that raw fish into my mouth when a few turns over the coal would have done us both a world of good. So he seems to have some knowledge of it, but I'm wondering how much of an opportunity he really had to encounter it as an actual food source that he would have sampled.
Fair enough. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not going to dismiss the possibility that he has had some in the past, and that might be a point that the fans in the Steel Watchers group have some valid point to, but I'm thinking that he might not have really had that opportunity to encounter it too much.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. I sort of actually had some questions about the scene before it when they're in the morgue.
Oh, okay.
Is it morgue policy to just give people information on random bodies? Because they seem to be able to just waltz into morgues fairly frequently and look at whoever they want. And this bit actually is one of my favorite parts, because you've got the morgue attendant who says, "Oh, you're really into this stuff," and Steele deadpans that it's just a hobby. And then after they get the information and they need to know that they know they need to talk to Dickerson, his comment about, "I got a lady mud wrestler you could have a look at, fresh." Eee. But is that like common to just walk into a morgue and say, "I want to see so-and-so"?
I wouldn't think so.
I would think you'd have to prove you'd be family.
I wouldn't think
or something.
so. But keep in mind that the morgue attendant is probably half hopped up on dope. I mean, that's the way he comes across.
He didn't look,
it's like, "Hey, man."
He really had his Walkman on.
Yeah. Also, the name Remington Steele does have a certain standing in the law enforcement community. So,
oh yeah, apparently in the morgue too.
Yes. Well, I mean, that's
because
part.
Dickerson later says he's a source.
Yeah. Well, the morgue is part of the law enforcement community in a sense. So, so it could just be that. Oh yeah, I've heard that name. Oh, you're here. So rules. Yeah, I know we got rules, but it's cool, man.
Well, except this guy
cool.
This guy thought it was a fetish. He didn't think that they were there on a case. He thought they were like super into looking at dead people, which.
Well,
Okay.
Given the fact that the guy's kind of zoned out, who knows?
Yeah.
I mean, he's sitting there with his Walkman headphones on. Walkman, that's an old cassette thing, people.
It is. Listen up, kids. Back in the day, before we had Spotify, we had tape cassettes.
Yeah, before we had Bluetooth headphones and smartphones, you had all these wires that ran from your ears down to this little box that had a cassette tape in it. Yes. Those were the days.
I carried that around. I carried my Walkman around until I think 2007. So I held out. I didn't want to give it up. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
We also have another acronym here, ENF, enigmatic and fragmented.
I was not a big fan of the acronyms in this one, but.
No, I thought that once was funny. I think they got silly as they went on, but I think there was a point where there was a bit of a comedy moment where Steele keeps rattling them off. It's later on. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
After the sushi restaurant, Laura has an encounter in the restroom with Craddock. She's got a great line there.
Payphone was only a dime. Here's another one. Payphone. You saved me a dime. Payphones don't exist anymore, much less them costing only a dime.
I was going to say, yeah, you're talking about how much it costs. And I'm going to say, hey, wait a second. Nobody even knows what a payphone is anymore.
There's not even, they're gone.
Yeah. Something I did some research on as part of another podcast I do, my White Collar podcast. And it was payphones. And if I remember right, the last payphones pretty much in the country were in New York, and those were taken out of service in the early 2010s. So yeah, they've been gone a while, but not as long as you might think. So anyway, but she's got a great line in there. You're trying to tell me this lady's room isn't big enough for the both of us?
Yeah. She has a few good lines here. I liked her naming names. Are we? Did you bring yours along, or do I have to go looking for it?
Yeah.
I thought that was it's pretty ballsy.
Yeah. Well, for some reason, and I don't know why, I went back to look at it, and there really isn't a similarity. But for some reason, this scene reminded me of the scene from Charade, where Hepburn and Cary Grant had been at a club, and she goes down and uses the phone booth downstairs, and one of the bad guys corners her in there. And it really does not play out the same way that this one does. But for some reason, this scene reminded me of that. So I don't know if this was intended to be something that was kind of a scene that was inspired by that, or homage to it, or what. But there was something about this scene that just really reminded me of that.
Also, was it common to have payphones in bathrooms?
It wasn't as uncommon as you might imagine.
I don't recall ever seeing that, but...
I would say more in low rent places like low-end clubs or low-end gas stations, things like that. But yeah, I think I recall seeing some phones in bathrooms from time to time in the past. But, that's been a long time. So let's see, back at the office, they're talking movies.
And we've also got another acronym, QWYA, question witnesses, yank answers, or quit while you're alive, depending on who you ask.
So they're discussing whether it's Enter the Dragon or the Yakuza. And of course, now Steele has Bernice doing film attributions.
Yeah. She comes in. I wonder, is that her only scene in the... No, she's later on urging them to drop it, isn't she? She's not in this one much.
Yeah, she's not in this one much. She's got a few bits, but yes, she's not got a lot in this one, unfortunately. So they decide, I guess it's the Yakuza. And then we see him at the theater. Murphy and Steele get into a little scuffle. And I thought this was interesting. Murphy tells Steele that he found the girl because he got a good description of the girl from the funeral from Laura.
Yeah.
And he caught up with her an hour ago. And Steele says, you located an Oriental girl down here from only Laura's description? Well, some of us do this for a living. And I thought that was a good exchange because it does highlight the fact that A, Murphy is a highly competent investigator.
Yeah. And
that B, Steele has so much to learn, even after having been at the agency for as long as he has, which granted we're not talking years at this point, but even as long as he's been there, he should have picked up a few things. And one of them is that a qualified, competent detective can perform some pretty magnificent feats.
Well, and really, all Steele did was call information and ask about the Palace of Heaven, which guided him to that movie theater. He didn't really do as much as what we assume Murphy did, which probably involved a number of steps more. But I guess if you could make the argument that Steele was using pure instinct and just hoping he'd get a hit when this is again the fact that I was an infant at this time speaking, but could you just call information and ask for info on anything? Because that sounds like an early version of Google.
Well, it wasn't quite like that. It was telephone information. It was you dial information, which was usually 0 for the operator. Although I think in later years it became 611, and you could give a name of an individual or a business, and they would.
I guess that's what he found. Was the theater.
Yeah, and for an individual, they would generally give you the phone number. I don't believe they would give you the address. Although if you said, well, I know that they live on this street or, somewhere in that area, they could use that information to help pinpoint which individual you're talking about so that they could give you the correct phone number. But if it was a business, they would give you the phone number and the address, but it wasn't where they would give you the hours of business and, it's a movie theater and this is what's currently showing and these are their ticket prices. It wasn't that extensive. It was just, phone number information.
Speaking of what's currently showing, I went down a rabbit hole trying to figure out what movie they were watching. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you did the same, but I
just presumed it was the Yakuza.
I don't think it was. Maybe, but I ended up Googling some of the text on the screen, and it came up with a couple of options. And one of them was Rashomon, which is the classic Kurosawa film about a samurai who is murdered in the forest. And the interesting thing that I found out about, because I've seen this movie, I saw it in a film class that I took, and I remembered this after reading the title. I was like, oh yeah, I've seen this one. It's a movie in which... And this trope has been used in film and television ever since. It's probably one of the most famous plot devices that we see now, which is various characters providing subjective, alternative, and contradictory versions of the same incident. So you see in TV and movies where you've got a thing that happened and they're all questioning everybody who was involved and they all tell their version of the story. And of course, their version is all slightly different. And that's called the Rashomon effect, which is named after this film. And I kind of wondered if that was the movie, just simply because we're all getting sort of various different versions of people in this. Like Murphy, for example, being irritated with Steele that he's the trained detective. He's the one that is actually meant to be doing these things. And Steele is the interloper. And they all have this different version of who each other is kind of thing, I think. I don't know. I could be just reaching for it. But some of the text led me to Rashomon. I don't know if that's actually it. It could be the Yakuza. But yeah, I spent like way too long trying to figure that.
Well, I guess I should take some blame for not having looked at the movie and just presuming that it was, because if you catch the scene there outside the theater when Murphy's complaining to Laura about Steele and his mantle. Oh,
I love that. The mantle of Remington Steele.
And
the way he says that is just perfect. Yeah, he's just so baffled that he could even think to say that.
But if you look at the theater marquee, it does say the Yakuza.
Yes, it does later. So I think I put in my notes, oh, was I wrong? Because I was Googling the text that they were saying. And so I wonder, I don't know. You're right. It's probably that.
And even Steele says, when they're talking about the Yakuza, the movie, Steele makes a comment later on that he thinks he paid to see that twice. Yeah, because he went back in. And one thing I recognized with him and Murphy is that it's not until Murphy does not like to call him Mr. Steele. When they tussle, Murphy finally sits back and notices who he's fighting with. He says, you. And he, most of the time, likes to call him you or that guy or anything but Mr. Steele. And if he does say Mr. Steele, it's very sarcastic. Yes.
He uses his lack of a name as an insult. He wants to emphasize it as a reminder of why he can't be trusted. And I think that that's interesting because I don't know that I noticed it before. And you're right. His commenting that he's surprised that he could just find him from a description. Some of us do this for a living. But it is sort of negating the fact that Steele did manage to find this woman on his own. Granted, she wanted to be found.
Yeah, I'm going to disagree with you on that. I'm going to disagree with you on that. He did not find her. She found him, as he later admits.
Fair.
She found him.
Yeah.
She let herself be found.
She did play him.
Yeah. See, she wanted Steele to find her. She wasn't necessarily wanting Murphy to find her.
She didn't. Yeah, that's true. She didn't show herself to Murphy, but it's an interesting thing because it kind of shows where both of them are at. Remington seems to respect Murphy to an extent, maybe even likes him. He keeps referring to them as a team. And I genuinely think that he believes that, or he wants to believe that. Was it the previous episode? He wanted them all to go to Jamaica. And every time he does that, it only makes Murphy angrier because I don't know. I wonder if Murphy sort of senses that Steele is trying to befriend him, or at least trying to be more friendly with him. And then, of course, it makes him angry because he doesn't want to be this guy's friend. He wants to be mad at him. He wants to hate him. So it kind of feels that Steele is making some kind of an effort at Murphy. It's just pissing Murphy off even more.
You say that Steele is constantly referring to them as a team, and he does. In fact, in this one, he says, I've realized that Remington Steele's more than one man. He's a team. You, Laura, Bernice, and me, of course. We're all part of that team. We're all Remington Steele. And so that is his, I think to some extent, he's trying to win an argument in this particular case, but I think he also does do that, as you say. He does think of them as a team. Murphy, I think, thinks of him as an anchor. We're a boat and you're the anchor and you're dragging us down.
Yeah.
And
that sounds about right.
So I think Murphy's, never mind the fact that there's this apparent romantic interest between Steele and Laura that is just grating on Murphy.
Yeah.
I think it's just the fact that he sees Steele as an obstacle, an anchor. He's somebody who keeps getting in the way.
Yep.
And which is his whole thing about the mantle when he's going off on Laura, is that
him and his mantle.
Well, he says he screwed up the whole operation, not to mention the fact that I nearly took his head off. And that's, I think, as much as anything, the thing that gets under Murphy's skin and sticks in his craw is that he's constantly screwing things up. Yes, he gets lucky, but you can't rely on luck as a detective. I mean,
No.
you can utilize it, but you can't rely on it. And Steele, the only thing Steele's got going for him at this point, as far as Murphy's concerned, is luck.
Yep. And a pretty face. And unfortunately, I think he believes that Laura's judgment is compromised by it. So it makes him even angrier because he is trying to steer her away from him, both as a romantic partner, but also for their business. Because if she's compromised by her feelings, then she's not necessarily going to, as we saw in like Thou Shalt Not Steal, she's maybe not thinking clearly when she makes her decisions.
Yeah. And even in this one, in this very scene, after Murphy just vents at Laura, her response is, look, I know it's been rough on you two, but I really thought you had better control than that, Murph.
Yeah.
Excuse me? You know, I've had this happen. I've seen this happen where somebody's getting picked on, bullied, abused, thrown under the bus. And the person who's supposed to be the arbiter, who is supposed to be the objective third party, sides with the person who's the aggressor and shifts the blame entirely to the person who's being abused and misused and mistreated. It's like, did Laura even listen to what Murphy said? Or did she just jump to a conclusion that Murphy must be the aggressor because he doesn't like Steele?
He does have a history of it.
He doesn't like Steele, so it must be his fault.
Yeah. To be fair, though, he does have a history of immediate. It's one of those things where he's always sort of pitting himself against Steele. So even if he's right, and I think in this case he is, that Steele got in the way and screwed things up, and as we find out later, basically was in the right place for the woman to find. She was looking for him. She knew he was going to come there. Laura immediately sides with Steele because Murphy is always going after him. And I think what bothers Murphy the most here is that at this point, he knows less about the investigation than Steele does. He's not as in on everything of what's going on. He knew to look for the woman, but the film reference, Laura immediately understands the movie reference. She's on board now with calling out film references for cases. And I think Murphy might be feeling a bit displaced.
Yeah, but because he wasn't in the office when the discussion of the movies took place. You're correct there. So, yeah, he is a little bit behind it in that sense. But, I got to say that I think that the fact that Murphy is always on Steele's case it's not fair of Laura to take the attitude, well, Murphy, you're always on his case, so you got to behave yourself, because he's always on Steele's case because he's right. You don't criticize somebody and say, well, you just got to be nicer and more understanding when they're right. You got to either deal with the other person to bring them up to speed or whatever, but you don't criticize him. You don't try and say, well, you need to change your attitude when they're right.
No, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with that. I just think from Laura's point of view, that's where she's coming from, because she might not even realize that he was right in that particular instance. She has seen Steele in moments that Murphy hasn't, where Steele has used instincts or used talents that he has to get information and things like that. So from where Laura's coming from, she wasn't there. She didn't see what happened, but Murphy freely admits that he nearly took his head off. He nearly screwed things up. I think if it were Laura from the first episode, she'd be 100% agreeing with Murphy that, oh, this guy is driving us crazy. And now I think she's starting to see that he's maybe trying to learn. So she's trying to mitigate that and keep everybody happy. And it's obviously
not working.
Resulted in this one. No, it's not. And she says, I thought you had better control. It's not really a fair assessment.
No.
For Murphy at this point. I think there are points where Murphy does behave in a way that's out of line, but maybe not this one necessarily.
And I think she's biased. I think she is seeing things through not just the fact that she knows some things that Murphy doesn't, because of, as you say, she's seen how Steele handles certain things, how he can make these intuitive leaps about things and come to certain conclusions. But I think she's just also biased because she is having feelings and she's allowing those to cloud her judgment. So.
And I mean, alternately, Murphy is also sort of biased on his end because
That's true.
He also has feelings for Laura. So it's one of those things where
he's definitely got some feelings about Steele.
Right. Yeah, they both got feelings. They both got very intense feelings about Remington Steele. They just happen to run both ways. And for Murphy, I think Murphy's also kind of worried that if Steele does start to become competent and start to become somebody that is good at what Murphy does, then Murphy will have no place, that he won't have a reason to be in Laura's life, or that he won't be as close with Laura because she will also have someone else to rely on and someone that she also has feelings for. They all have feelings. We all have feelings about Remington Steele. So, except for maybe Bernice.
You mean he might be afraid that he will be written out of the series?
Oh yeah, that'll never happen.
That would never happen. Anyway, so after the mantle, they head back to the restaurant. They see Mike being kidnapped. After Mike is kidnapped, they're following him. They get captured themselves, and they get taken to the geisha house. And it's
Scowl and Crinkle.
Yeah, Scowl
and
English
Crinkle
law
makes
firm.
it sound like a London law firm.
And
I really like that line.
yeah, I mean, she's got a good point. That does sound like it. And so then they meet their opponent, and I have to question the computer display. If I remember correctly, Japanese is not read from top to bottom, left to right.
No, it's up and down.
Exactly. Yeah. So
yeah. Although you could maybe ask yourself if it's done that way because they're using an American computer, and it might not have had the capability of altering language text. I don't know. I'm guessing at this, but you're right. It would go up and down for sure.
You could take the first vertical column and rotate it 90 degrees and make it a horizontal column.
Yeah.
So I guess in that sense it could work, but it struck me as a little bit odd, but I don't see a brand name on here. I can't really make one out.
Commodore 64.
Are you serious? No, it can't be.
I'm guessing.
So, I mean, it's probably at this time, it's more likely from an American company. I don't know that there were too many. There were a lot of Japanese companies probably making the computers, but they were not necessarily selling them and producing them for the Asian market. They were probably mostly being produced for the U.S. market. So, yeah, you're probably right that it's just a
like a formatting problem.
Yeah, it's just a convention that the computer uses that they had to adapt to.
Even now, when you get a computer, if you're using it to write in a language that isn't English, you have to switch your keyboard functions, right? Mm-hmm. So that it could just be that the computers were too primitive to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's my theory.
So anyway, they have this little meeting with Tanaka, and it's one of those...
BF, bloody fool.
Well, there's that too, acronym. Yes. But it's one of those meetings where nothing overtly threatening is said, but the subtext says so much. And it's...
Oh, yeah.
He wants his thing. Nobody knows what it is, but he wants his thing. And if he doesn't get it, it's going to get ugly.
Yep. And this is interesting because, well, for a couple of reasons, Murphy's not there. So going back to our previous conversation, they're in the car. When they're in the car and they do the scowl and crinkle bit, it shows that they understand one another, at least on a level that they didn't before, because he makes the comment of, when you're worried, you get this little crinkle, and she says you scowl. So these are things you don't normally notice about somebody that you've not spent a lot of time with. But when they're in this moment, he, first of all, admits that he was wrong. He says he's a bloody fool. He realizes he's been had, that he was tricked. This is the moment where he admits that he was at first trying to win the argument, but now he truly wants to learn from her. And then the stuff about being threatened, this is probably the only part of the episode that is somewhat accurate in terms of Japanese culture, in the sense that much of Japanese culture is built around civilization, politeness, decorum. There's a sort of order to society. And I think it makes sense that he wouldn't outright say, we're going to chop your head off with a samurai sword, even if that might be a bit of a stereotype, that he would threaten them covertly. And it's a really, in my opinion, that's a kind of a good moment. Laura takes no crap. He even says, give him hell, chief, to her as they walk in.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's a really neat moment. And yeah, that sort of civilized behavior is very much part of their culture, that politeness, that order to society.
Yeah, and he kind of references that when Laura starts to get all bent out of shape, and she makes a move toward Tanaka, and the bodyguards or whatever they are there pull out their swords. And he says, it would be most embarrassing for you to die at my table.
Yep.
And so, yeah, there's that. We're bad guys. We are going to kill you, but we're going to do it politely.
Yeah, politely. As a Canadian, I can fully embrace that idea, that polite, you're going to die, eh? Might sound a bit different, but still.
But we're going to do it nicely and politely, yes.
We're going to do it nicely. You're going to get maybe a little pack of Timbits before you go. It'll be, it'll be pleasant. The Canadians will get the joke.
So after this, then they are back at the office coming up with possible plans of attack. And
then we get the new acronym, UND.
Unexpected and daring, yes.
Which Steele guesses unique and different, uncomfortable and deadly, unified and dedicated, useful and diligent. Those are his 4 guesses.
Yeah. I'm not sure where foolhardy fits into the 2 letters there, the UND, but I think it's kind of foolhardy.
It's stupid.
Well, first of all,
it's really stupid.
Laura, even under all the makeup, is clearly not an Asian woman.
Yeah.
Secondly, she has no clue about the language. And we see this.
Or the process of like how to serve the tea. There's actually a specific way to do it as well.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't really comment on that, but you're right. She doesn't know the language. She doesn't look Japanese, even with the makeup on.
And that's one of those things where you look at it and say, okay, we know you're in a desperate situation. We know that you got to come up with some sort of crazy plan to get him out of there because you don't have anything to trade for him. But this seems really, really risky.
It's extremely, although I do admit that the scene just before they go in with Steele and Murphy and the shooting the hoops was probably one of the best parts of this episode, where he says, what do you do on a Saturday? And Murphy's like, oh yeah, I can just see you in a pair of cutoff shorts shooting hoops. And he's like, well, I've shot a lot of things, but I don't think I've shot a hoop. Are they difficult?
Yeah, it's a very large animal.
Is it a large animal?
Yeah, I love to hunt.
That part was worth it. I love to hunt.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a really silly plan, and they're lucky it worked.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and granted, I understand they didn't have a whole lot of options because, as I think it was Laura said, they can't trade him the thing for Mike because they don't know what the Palace of Heaven is. They don't know how big of an empty bag to make it, and
yeah. Well, and in this case, it wouldn't have been really like it would have. Assuming if it's a computer code, it's on a disk,
yes.
Right? So.
Yeah, but they didn't. They had no clue.
Yeah, and the only thing I don't really buy is we can't go to the police. They might kill Mike. I think she's, I don't know. I'm trying to think of how to say it, but it's pretty egotistical to assume that the police would not be able to get somebody who had been kidnapped out of that situation, that only they could do it. They've kind of been trained for things like hostage negotiations and hostage scenarios.
Yeah. Less so in the 80s. Certainly not in the way that police deal with those types of situations now. But I can see where she might have a valid point, because they don't really have any proof that Mike has been kidnapped yet. I mean, that they could take to the police.
Yeah, okay, good point.
And if they did go to the police and the police showed up, and Tanaka would be very, very polite and say he's...
Yeah, that's true.
He was here. He was our guest. And it's unfortunate that there was this misunderstanding. You know, he'd be very, very polite, and the police probably wouldn't want to push it, especially if there's been any kind of a history of ill will between the police department and the Asian community there at that time. And of course, in the movies and TV shows, there's always this distrust of the police within the Asian communities or the, you know, whatever ethnic community we're talking about in any particular given show. So assuming that there is any kind of validity to that theory and that notion, I can see where it wouldn't necessarily get them anywhere. You're probably correct in that there's probably other avenues that they could have pursued, but I think also there's some validity to the idea that it probably wouldn't have, or at least going to the police probably wouldn't have gotten them much.
Other avenues, you mean, besides dressing up like a geisha and attempting to...
Yeah.
Those avenues?
And plus, you also have to keep in mind that going through some of those other channels takes time, and they didn't have time.
Yeah, that's true.
So I can see it both ways.
But it worked.
Yeah, well,
they got him out.
Yeah. In Hollywood, everything always works. Isn't it amazing?
Yeah. Well, sort of. I mean.
So they get him out, and then Dickerson shows up at the office.
So before Dickerson shows up, this is one thing that drove me crazy. Laura says she's going to go change. She's in full makeup. She's in a kimono. She's got a wig, which presumably involves bobby pins and whatnot in order to hold it in place. She was not in there changing it took her 41 seconds.
You timed it.
I timed it because Steele goes in that other room with Kenji. Mike. They're talking about Kenji, and then she comes in, no makeup. She's in another outfit. Her hair's down, and I'm going, no, that would take as a woman. Makeup takes a long time, especially makeup that thick. Would take at least 20 some odd minutes to get off. I realize I don't have that kind of time, but 41 seconds was just silly. She's coming out and I'm like, how did she do that? She's in another outfit. There's no makeup. She doesn't even have like bits left on her face. 41 seconds. I'm just going to say it.
She's amazing.
Yeah, that's impressive. I want to know her secret. But Dickerson shows up.
Dickerson shows up and they tackle him, and he's got the information that they think they want. But as it turns out, the guy who picked up Kenji's body was Kenji.
Dun, dun, dun.
So now their case is totally changed.
Yeah, we're in another movie.
The Third Man, Orson Welles.
Yeah.
So then Mike runs out again. Impulsive Mike.
Oh my God, Mike, Ito, you deserve to be kidnapped at this point. I don't know if they've had a dumber client, really. He's not that bright.
No.
I want to know what happened to my brother, and he just runs off. Or I'm going to go find him. And why? No, stay.
Yeah, he's very impulsive, and from looking at the character in the show, he's supposed to be in his 20s. He owns a business. Yeah, it's inconsistent with the type of person he should be, based on all the other evidence. But so he takes off, and they follow him, and they all wind up back at the temple.
Well, they follow him after Dickerson asks Steele to autograph a death certificate.
Is that kosher?
I would think no, but I also don't think it's kosher to allow randos to look at dead bodies.
Yeah. So I mean, the Los Angeles morgue, they've got some work to do on their protocols and securities.
Their policies, yeah. And who they hire to, I guess you'd have to be a little bit morbid to work in that particular area anyway, but still. Dickerson,
at least between the two that we saw, Dickerson is at least closer to a rational, sane human being than the first guy. Yeah. So I'll give him that. But yeah, he's got this. Yeah. Would you sign this death certificate? Come on, Dickerson. So anyway, they follow Mike back to the temple where they find Craddock dead, and they meet Kenji, who has the computer disk that is the whole focus of this thing, the Palace of Heaven, documenting Tanaka's entire operation. And I don't know. Does Kenji killing Craddock really prove anything to Tanaka? I mean, he says that Tanaka will know I didn't betray him because I killed Craddock, but that doesn't really change what apparently happened, which was one of those things where we're going to spread the word that you did this, even though you didn't, because we're trying to put pressure on you. I don't see that it really changes anything with Tanaka.
No, it feels like a more complex plot than they had time for, if that makes sense, script-wise. You'd have a lot more moving pieces in a plot like this if you were, say, doing a movie than you were, in a 45-minute episode of TV. So I think we're just supposed to assume that will tie a bow on it, but you're right. It really wouldn't convince the leader of a underworld, the Japanese underworld, that he didn't talk just because he's killed the guy that was hunting him. It wouldn't, I don't think, prove anything.
You could even make the argument that merely proved that Kenji did betray, that he did talk because he wants to eliminate the person who can prove that he did that thing. Or, whatever. Yeah,
it would work against him for sure, I think.
Conceivably, yeah, I think so. I think it could be interpreted a couple different ways, and I don't think that there's any one way that is an automatic.
I will say, though, that Sab Shimono, I looked him up, the actor who plays Kenji, what the actor who plays Mike Ito lacks, he has. He does this is a really emotional scene that he does really well. Mm-hmm. And you feel bad for him. I think this is the first sympathetic murderer that we've had so far, where he's killed 2 people. He's not a nice guy, and presumably more than that, since he's worked for the Yakuza for some time. He's probably got a number of murders under his belt, but he turns himself in willingly, and you feel bad for him, at least on some level.
Yeah, and you can see that as a character in this scene, talking about what's happened, talking about Mike, him wanting to provide for Mike and provide not only financially for Mike, but provide a way out of the life that he's in for Mike.
Yeah.
You can see the strain there that he's got when he's talking. And yeah, he does that very well. It's somewhat restrained with just a little edge of tension.
I think the restrained works far better than the Mike Ito, I want to know what happened to my brother. Tell me what happened, Steele. Like, the outbursts just kind of felt silly, but yeah, it was very understated the way he did that scene, and it worked.
Tanaka and Steele. Does Steele having the computer disc, effectively muzzle Tanaka and the Yakuza? I wouldn't think so. I would think it would
put a target on them.
I would have thought that they would have had to deal with it in some other way as well. On the other hand, I guess there could be an argument made that as long as both had something on the other, that neither one could do anything about it. But you'd think that at some point they would try to figure out some way of doing something about it that wasn't going to come back on them.
Yeah, that mutually assured destruction concept.
Yeah. Yeah, because at some point somebody has to slip, and that's your opportunity. So I would think that it's not over yet.
Also, if she's got a disc with proof that Tanaka is running this Yakuza organization, why wouldn't she turn it into the... Again, I go back to why wouldn't she turn it into the police? But I wouldn't want that proof sitting around the office. I would just want to turn it into them and let them handle it.
Well, and then what about the potential legal problems, the problems with her licensing? Because by having that, by being presumably aware of the criminal enterprise that Tanaka is running, doesn't that make her an accessory? Doesn't that put her in a precarious legal position?
I don't know that it would if she got the evidence and turned it in right away. I think if she held on to it, sure, but... Yeah,
that's what I'm meaning, is if she held on to it, which is the implication here, that I hold on to the evidence, you leave Mike alone, and everybody's happy. Well, she's now, or the agency, Steele, Laura, are now committing a crime.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
And doesn't that make them vulnerable? Because after all, if I know you've committed a crime and you don't want that information left out, you don't want that information to be revealed, what can I get you to do? And you could always set up, I presume that Tanaka has some way of setting it up so that he, even if the information about the operation he has gets out, he can, plausible deniability.
Yeah.
Our catchphrase for the podcast.
That and he fits the suit.
Yes. But I mean, you'd think that he would have some things in place or could get some things in place that would give him plausible deniability.
Yeah.
And then be able to use the fact that they are committing a crime by holding on to this evidence, by not reporting a supposed criminal organization. They could use that to provide them leverage, which is another great TV show, to force Steele and the agency to do things or to ignore things or whatever.
Yeah, it's an odd ending that they get this disc and it's supposed to just, if I were Laura, I would not feel comfortable knowing that I was allowing this organization to continue to operate because they're murderers. They're killing people.
Yes.
They're doing crime.
they're the Asian version of the mafia.
Yeah.
So yeah, it does seem a little bit inconsistent. What about the last scene there at the restaurant again?
It feels like a date. They're out together. They're having dinner.
Kind of. Yeah. Kind of. Octopus.
Yeah. Which, okay, again, I'm gonna call foul on that because we know, again, in spoilers, but in future episodes, he admits to spending time in the Mediterranean, and you're gonna tell me that he's never once encountered some form of octopus as a seafood?
Or here's the other thing. Escargot?
Yeah.
You wanting to tell me he hasn't had escargot?
Right.
How is octopus any different than escargot?
It's one of those things.
Wait a second. I better not say that because then somebody might hold that against me and try and get me to eat escargot. But,
he's from the UK. They eat blood pudding. Literally coagulated pig's blood on bread. And I know, I've had it. It comes with a breakfast, a British breakfast. You get a British fry-up, that's what you get. So I don't know that octopus is any grosser than pig's blood on bread. Just a thought.
Well, I can see your point.
Haggis. I mean, the Scottish. Yes. He's not Scottish, but still, he's Scottish adjacent. He would have come across haggis too.
Yeah, you'd think that he's had enough exotic food experiences that even if he hadn't had sushi, even if he hadn't had octopus, that it wouldn't be so out there that he would have that strong a reaction.
Yeah, it's a pretty strong reaction. He just bleh, comes out of his mouth. He's disgusted by it. Okay, it's a bit of a.
I've had calamari and.
It's not that bad. It's a bit chewy.
My biggest problem with it is maybe it's just the ones that I've had, the servings that I've had, the way it was prepared or something. But to me, it was a little bit like eating slices of bicycle tire inner tube.
Yeah, rubbery.
Rubbery.
It's very rubbery. Yeah.
It was not a pleasant experience. And it wasn't the taste just so much as the texture, the fact that it was like chewing a piece of rubber.
Yep. But you're right. Escargot, black pudding, there's a number of foods he would probably have encountered that are weirder than octopus.
Far more shocking.
Hell, there is a dish in Britain called spotted dick. That is a thing they eat.
Called what?
Spotted dick. Yeah.
Oh, spotted dick.
So,
well, isn't that just basically like a sausage?
No, that's bangers and mash. Spotted dick is a type of pudding.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Okay. See, I knew bangers were a sausage, but I thought that spotted dick was as well. A different type of sausage.
Some sort of pudding, I think. I don't know. I've never ordered it because I don't want to say I'd like some spotted dick. That's literally the only reason why I've never ordered it in a restaurant. I just think that would...
oh, that is so sexist of you.
Yeah, it is. Freely admit that one.
Yes. Anyway.
This is where we ended up.
Yeah. And of course, this is the point at which Steele says, well, he's starting to feel the urge to become a flashy frontman again.
Yeah.
But of course, once you've opened Pandora's box, you can never put Pandora back in.
But it's kind of, like I said, this is why it feels kind of date-like, because they are smiling at each other, they're laughing, or at least friendship. They've at least achieved that friendship that they didn't have in the past, where it's not always antagonistic and she's not always irritated with him like a small child. They're actually on the same level sharing a meal.
Yeah, they are far more relaxed with each other than in most previous situations. Usually there's either some professional tension, or sexual tension, or sexual pressure. But this is none of those. It's just two people having some time together, enjoying each other's company as people, not as potential conquest, not as a potential rival in work or anything like that. It's just two people hanging out.
And this is where I say that earlier that Murphy's worried about being replaced, because I could see her having this same kind of meal with Murphy, where it's, like you said, not necessarily a date or any sort of agenda to it. It's just two people hanging out, and there's a level of trust or a level of friendliness there that isn't necessarily there before with her and Steele. So
yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that carries forward into the future episodes.
Yeah.
Because yes, we've all seen the episodes, but I don't think we've ever really looked at them in the same way. I know I've seen things that I haven't seen before, and seeing threads and such going through that I hadn't noticed before. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see that. Anything that we didn't cover in the episode that you want to hit?
I think that was about it. I mean, we kind of hit all the movies. There was a lot of movies in this one. There was the Third Man, there was the Yakuza, there was the other one he mentions, brain's blanking on it, but he mentions another one earlier up, Enter the Dragon, maybe? But yeah, and then of course I went down that Rashomon rabbit hole that may or may not be relevant. So, there was
a lot of
few movies in this one.
Yeah, although primarily the Yakuza.
Yeah,
and then eventually the Third Man is the primaries. So, website www.SteeleWatching.com. Show notes are there. We will have links to the Yakuza and the Third Man, and probably the other movies that were mentioned in this episode as well, and some other resources. Which you want to hit those?
Steele Watchers, both the Steele Watchers page as well as the Steele Watchers Facebook group, where there are many, many Steele Watchers that gather and share fan fiction and questions and pictures and screen caps and all kinds of fun stuff. It is a very lively and active group, so join us. This is the pitch. Join us. And of course, the Instagram and Twitter as well.
Yeah, and there's a lot of good conversations going on in that group. In fact, I'm trying to think. I just had a mind blank. I was just thinking about it, the conversation that was going on this morning.
Yeah, my brain's blank too, but it was good. It was so interesting. We've both forgotten what it was, but it was.
Yeah. Oh, it was somebody had commented that they were getting their boyfriend to watch the series, and
yes.
every time another episode came up, it was, this is a good one. Oh, this is a good episode. This is a good episode, and we wound up talking about the overall quality of all of the episodes, and how even the lowest quality, the worst of the episodes of Remington Steele were better than most of the other stuff that was on TV.
The interesting thing that I will say about that, in addition, with the exception of season 5, which we will get to, most Steele Watchers, we can pinpoint one or two episodes we don't like, but overall seasons, it stays fairly consistent up until that aforementioned season 5. But it stays, I don't think, like other shows I can point out, I really didn't like season 3, or season 1 was good, but the rest of it was bad. This one is more like, that one episode I wasn't like. This particular episode that we just talked about is not, I don't hate it, but it's not an episode I go back to necessarily. No, I sometimes agree. I forget about it. It's one of those episodes where I forget it exists until I'm doing a rewatch, and then I'm like, yeah. And then throughout the entire episode, I'm like, what was the Palace of Heaven again? I've seen this episode several times, and I always forget until it's revealed at the end. So there are, I think, maybe episodes that are forgettable, or at least maybe not as memorable.
Mm-hmm.
They're not bad per se. They're just not as memorable as some of the really, really good ones. And then there's maybe like one or two genuinely not good episodes, but overall the quality is amazing.
Yeah. Well, they wreck the curve because the overall quality of the episodes is so high that, as I had commented in the Facebook group, that this high mark becomes the average against what the rest of the series is judged at. And so when you have these episodes like this one that don't reach that mark, you look at it and say, well, that's not really that good an episode. But when you judge it compared to other TV shows, the bar is so much higher.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That when you look at this episode, that wasn't very good. It's only not that very good in comparison to the rest of the Remington Steele episodes. It's not a fair comparison to these other TV shows, because these other TV shows had a lot of clunkers and their overall average was lower. So even at its worst, Remington Steele was better than most.
That's a good tagline there. Even at its worst, we're still better than the other guys. Moonlighting. No,
That's
I'm kidding.
right.
We're being nice to Moonlighting.
Yeah. I wasn't going to say it. I'll let you say it. But yes. So, yes, the Facebook page, Twitter, Instagram, Steele Watchers group. And then the next episode, you are taking the lead on in the Steele of the Night.
And it is replacing the word still in this case yet again.
Yes.
Yeah.
Popular
this
use
time
for
for
the
real.
word Steele. Yes, for real.
No commas needed.
Remember, commas
Save lives.
Yeah, I was going to say commas kill, but I knew that was wrong.
Or they can also save lives. Let's eat, Grandma.
Yeah, I imagine that there's a few instances where they could kill as well. Anyway, thank you for listening, and we'll see you at the next episode in the Steele of the Night. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.